Whether you're new to cybersecurity or new to cybersecurity on the Microsoft stack, your certification journey really begins with the SC-900 exam. Think of it as Azure Fundamentals Cybersecurity Edition. And this updated exam cram session and the practice quiz that goes with it are designed to bring you up to speed on all the concepts you need to pass SC-900 no matter when you're taking the exam. More on this in a minute. In fact, in this session I will touch on every line item mentioned in the skills measured list for this exam. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and this video is designed to get you further, faster down the road to cybersecurity expertise. I am very excited to be your guide, so let's get started. And before we get into the details here, let's talk for just a minute about what you can expect on the SC-900 exam. And that will explain a lot about why we're preparing, how we're preparing. So the first thing to remember here is this is a fundamentals exam. So just as AZ-900 is Azure Fundamentals, SC-900 is really Microsoft Cybersecurity Fundamentals. So you'll be expected to describe many different features and concepts and capabilities, not design, not implement, not plan, describe. So expect lots of single line, multiple choice questions, not deeply technical. This is a 60-minute exam. Expect 50 questions or less, give or take. And in this video, we will touch on every line item called out in the SC-900 skills measured document. So the exam consists of 4 objective domains. The first relates to concepts around security, compliance, and identity. So we'll touch on concepts like zero trust, shared responsibility model, defense in depth. We'll dig into common threats, and we'll talk about the basics of encryption. Moving into objective domain 2, we'll touch on the capabilities of Microsoft Identity and Access Management Solutions. So we'll be digging into Azure Active Directory, as you might guess. We'll talk about identity models, identity types, identity attacks, multi-factor authentication, and Windows Hello, just to name a few. Domain 3 touches on the capabilities of a wide variety of Microsoft security solutions. Network security groups, Azure Firewall, Azure Bastion, Sentinel, Security Center, and many more. And then finally, we'll round out our session on the capabilities of Microsoft compliance solutions in Objective Domain 4. And we'll really be talking a lot about compliance and governance in this domain. And there are some words in the skills measure document of every Microsoft exam that are important for you to remember. This list is not definitive or exhaustive. That means there may be some topics that come up on the exam, some features that are mentioned in questions that do not appear in this list of skills measured. So, in a couple of areas where I see a feature described in a less than complete fashion, I'm going to take a minute and inject just a bit of additional context to round out the picture for you. And in those areas, it will only take a minute and simply ensure that you are better prepared on exam day. And I am very excited to share with you that with this training comes a free SC-900 practice quiz. It's now available. You'll find a link in this video's description. So essentially, you'll come back down to this video's description and you will see the free SC-900 practice exam. It's 85 questions, one for every skill measured on this exam. You can simply come to this page. You don't need to log in. You just hit the start button and begin answering questions. When you get through the questions, you can hit finish. Your score will be calculated and you will be presented with the answers as well as explanations. And in many cases, you will find links to additional reading. And when you see those URLs in that additional reading, you simply click on that URL, it'll open up in a new tab, and you can continue to go through and check your work. I really hope it's helpful in your exam prep. If you have any questions stemming from the quiz, feel free to reach out in the comments or on LinkedIn. So for our SC-900 training here, we're implementing an evergreen approach. So what is an evergreen edition in a YouTube video sense? Well, quite simply, as updates are released for the SC-900 exam, we will continually update this course with short videos to cover what's new in the latest update, quite likely with little 5 or 10-minute addendums to cover those new topics. You'll find links to those short video updates in this video's description. So this video will live on in perpetuity. And if you come to this video's description, you'll be able to scroll down, and right here under What's New for SC-900, today you see it mentions the video includes all topics in the July 26, 2021 update, which is today. In the future, if new topics are added, you will find links to those topics right here. And as with virtually all of my certification focus videos, a PDF copy of this presentation is available in the video description. If you hit the notification bell, you'll get a heads up every time I drop a video similar to this one. And that being said, let's dig into Objective Domain 1, which is describe the concepts of security, compliance, and identity. If I look at the skills measured document, this domain covers security methodologies, security concepts, and Microsoft security and compliance principles. We'll begin with Zero Trust Security. So Zero Trust Security addresses the limitations of the legacy network perimeter-based security model, where the firewall at the edge of the network was our perimeter. So Zero Trust Security treats user identity as the control plane and assumes compromise or breach in verifying every request. So essentially, no entity is trusted by default. In Zero Trust Security, we verify identity, manage devices, manage apps, and protect data in all scenarios. So let's talk about the shared responsibility model. So when you're working on premises in your own data center with your own servers, it's quite easy because there is no shared responsibility. Securing your environment is 100% yours from the wire to the application. But as we move into the cloud, we hand off some responsibility to the CSP or cloud service provider, Microsoft in this case. So when we think about IaaS, infrastructure as a service, which is server virtualization, you'll see Microsoft is taking on management of some of the core functions here in the stack for us. And as we move into platform as a service, they're taking on some additional responsibility. And by the time we move into software as a service, we are effectively just using a service that is delivered to us 100% by the CSP. Do we have to manage the security of our users on SaaS? Of course we do. Are we responsible for securing our data, access to our data? Of course. Do we need to manage and secure users' devices? Absolutely. But the service itself is not managed by us, so it really allows us to focus on our business, which is part of what makes the cloud so attractive. So let's break these down just a bit further. When we look at infrastructure as a service, the CSP provides building blocks like network, storage, compute, and the virtualization layer. We're just managing our VMs and patching our VMs. The CSP manages the staff, the hardware, the data center. Those are all problems off our plate. We're shifting those over to the CSP. Good examples of this: Azure Virtual Machines, Amazon EC2, and GCP Compute Engine is server virtualization on the Google platform. Let's look at platform as a service. You see here, the CSP is taking responsibility all the way up to runtime. As a customer, we're responsible for deployment and management of our apps. So the CSP manages provisioning, configuration, hardware, operating system. So we're not patching anymore. Good examples here include Azure SQL Database, API management, Azure App Service, three just top of mind. And then software as a service. We're handing off even more responsibility to the CSP. We really just configure the features. We do need to secure user access. We need to deal with securing our data, so we're not allowing people to look at our data who shouldn't be. We need to make sure users are accessing our service from secure devices. But the CSP is responsible for management, operation, and availability of that service. So good examples here include Office 365, ServiceNow, Salesforce, all names I suspect you've heard of. Now, in 2021, we see Microsoft presenting this shared responsibility model in a new way in recent history here. So this is still correct, but if you look at the governance documentation in Microsoft Docs, you'll see this model presented in a different way. but it doesn't really mean anything different in terms of what I've just explained. So you'll see here that in the 2021 edition, I call it, that there is some responsibility always retained by the customer, but you'll notice that that responsibility is account and identity, devices, and information and data, exactly what I just described. And it's different here because Microsoft is presenting it differently. The terms are different, as you can see. So regardless of which one you see, the truth of the matter remains the same. And I want to answer a question that comes up quite a lot with customers. Do we really have better security in the cloud? And when we think about commodity resources like server virtualization or even deploying web applications, for example, I would say the answer is yes, and here's why. So security is very challenging, and it's often under-resourced in most companies. And so what you find is a patchwork of responsibilities that are met while others that are not met, and some that are partially met, so we don't get a good solid picture of security throughout our environment. Whereas when we work with a cloud service provider like Microsoft, when we shift those commodity responsibilities to the CSP, they are dealt with in a very consistent, uniform, and secure fashion that we can feel good about. So if you've ever been asked that question and you don't know the answer, now you know. Next up, let's talk about defense in depth. This is really just the concept of a layered approach that doesn't rely on one method to completely protect your environment. We implement, anti-malware protection on our endpoints, but we also turn on a firewall, and we perhaps enable extended detection and response, or XDR capability. So we're adding multiple layers because we don't have to catch attackers at every layer, but we have to have at least one layer in there that catches them before we get to that breach scenario. I want to touch on a few common threats that may come up on the exam. So data breach is the first that comes to mind, and that's when data is stolen, including personal data, what we might call PII, or personally identifiable information, perhaps financial data. Dictionary attacks. So these are password attacks using programs that have built-in dictionaries. Basically, they would use all dictionary words to attempt to find the correct password in hopes that the user has a standard dictionary word as their password. These are very preventable, of course, with Azure Active Directory. And brute force attacks, another password attack, and in this case they're attempting to break the password by trying all possible key combinations and variations. So really the efficacy, the effectiveness of these attacks is really going to depend on your password complexity and then the hacker's tools and compute capacity. So ransomware, one of the most common and impactful attacks out there. So ransomware infects a target machine and then uses encryption technology to encrypt documents, spreadsheets, and other files stored on that system with a key only known to the malware creator. And the user at that point is unable to access their files, and they receive some sort of ominous pop-up message that warns them the files will be permanently deleted unless a ransom is paid within a short period of time. A ransomware is a Trojan variant. So ransomware countermeasures I thought would be worth talking about for just a moment. So countermeasures would include backing up your computer, storing backups separately, user awareness training. So cloud-hosted email and file storage ease this process. So when you have, for example, OneDrive and SharePoint, you have previous versions, 500 previous versions of a file you can go back to, and the controlled folders feature that we can configure in Windows 10 with Intune protects against ransomware, incidentally. Now, prevention. Update and patch computers. Teach your users to proceed cautiously with web links that they are not certain about. Use caution with email attachments coming in. Verify email senders. Use preventative software programs. So all of this is very much preventable using Microsoft 365 security features, which really is AI-driven, machine learning-driven cloud services that are going to offer a lot of help with these. So other common threats, denial of service. So denial of service attack is a resource consumption attack that's intended to prevent legitimate activity on a victimized system. So it will consume all of the system's resources, if that's network or compute, for example, processing. Distributed denial of service is a denial of service attack that utilizes multiple compromised computer systems, often a bot network, as the sources of attack traffic. So with firewalls, intrusion detection, disabling broadcast packets, entering or leaving our network, disabling echo reply, so think ping reply, and patching, denial of service attacks are very preventable. And we'll talk about Azure DDoS and some other features later in this session. But denial of service attacks are a class of attacks, and there are many different types of denial of service and distributed denial of service attacks out there. Microsoft Cloud Services have protections built in, as we'll discuss, that help you with these. So web application vulnerabilities, a common threat used to compromise web front-end and back-end databases, are SQL injection attacks, which use unexpected input into a web form to gain unauthorized access to an underlying database. This is not a new attack. It can be prevented through good code practices. Input validation is the best way to deal with this, using prepared SQL statements, limiting account privileges, but it's not new at all. It can be prevented through just reasonable code practices. But just know that SQL injection is really just putting unexpected input into a web form typically to get access to that backend. So other common threats here. Rootkit, which is escalation or elevation of privilege. So these are freely available on the internet and exploit known vulnerabilities in various operating systems, enabling attackers to elevate privilege. So you want to keep security patches up to date, use anti-malware software. Protecting against rootkits is, generally speaking, well within your control. Exploits take advantage of vulnerabilities in software. So a vulnerability is like a hole in your software that malware uses to get onto your device. Vulnerability is a weakness, so to speak, would be another way of saying it. Malware exploits these vulnerabilities to bypass your computer security safeguards to infect your device. And for sure, I'm going into a bit more detail about these common threats than you're likely to see on the exam, just to make sure I hit on a few concepts to ensure that when you see that question, I hit on one hot button term that may help you pick the right answer a little more easily. So let's talk about a Trojan horse. So that's a software program that appears good and harmless, but it carries a malicious hidden payload that has the potential to wreak havoc on a system. So hidden payload is the key there. So a good defense here, allow only software from trusted sources. Don't let your end users install software. All very possible with the Microsoft 365 stack. If we use Microsoft Intune, that is one element of preventing unwanted software from being installed on our system. We can manage a little more for our users. So let's talk about worms. So a worm is a type of malware that can copy itself, and it often spreads through a network by exploiting security vulnerabilities. It'll spread through email, text message, file sharing, social networking, really any way it can, and subject to how the worm author has written it. The key here being a worm is malware that can copy itself, thus the highlight there. And let's wrap this section up by talking about zero-day exploits. So a zero-day exploit is an attack that uses a vulnerability that's either unknown to anyone but the attacker or known only to a limited group of people. Oftentimes, basic security practices can prevent zero-day exploits. For example, patching your systems. And today, AI-driven antivirus and EDR, XDR solutions are very common, and these can help identify the malicious behaviors of zero-day exploits. So again, XDR is extended detection and response. Microsoft has an XDR solution we'll touch on later in this video. The SC-900 exam assumes you are able to describe encryption. In case you are new to cybersecurity and don't know much about encryption, I'm going to take about 5 minutes and share some fundamental concepts of encryption that will certainly go beyond what you'll see on the exam, but that will be very useful to you throughout your career as a cybersecurity professional and will certainly make any question you see on the exam related to encryption easier for you to answer. So we'll start by talking about symmetric encryption versus asymmetric encryption. So in symmetric encryption, the sender and recipient communicate using a single shared key. That's how they encrypt and decrypt data. An example of a symmetric encryption algorithm is AES, commonly used in the Windows world. And symmetric algorithms tend to be quite fast, and they are used in bulk data encryption. Asymmetric encryption, on the other hand, involves the sender and recipient, each party in the conversation, having their own public and private keys. That private key they don't share with any other user. Let's actually walk through an asymmetric encryption conversation. So we have Franco on the left and Maria on the right. So Franco sends a message to Maria requesting her public key, and Maria freely sends her public key to Franco, who then uses Maria's public key to encrypt the message, and he sends it to her. Maria uses her private key to decrypt the message. So only Maria can decrypt that message because only Maria has her private key. And of course, if Maria were initiating a message to Franco, these steps would simply be reversed. So asymmetric key types. So public keys are shared amongst the communicating parties. Private keys are kept secret. To encrypt a message, you use the recipient's public key. To decrypt a message, you would use your own private key. So when someone has encrypted a message with your public key, your private key would be used to decrypt the message, just as we saw in the example. So with digital signatures, to sign a message, you use your own private key, and to validate a signature, you use the sender's public key. So it's using asymmetric cryptography. And each party has both a private key and a public key. The public key they share, the private key they don't. Even if you're not well versed in encryption, you've probably heard the phrase digital signature come up many times. A digital signature is a mathematical algorithm used to validate the authenticity and integrity of a message. So a message could mean an email, a credit card transaction, or a digital document. A digital signature creates a virtual fingerprint that is unique to that person or entity. That entity could be a person, or it could be a processing system, for example, processing transactions. And digital signatures rely on asymmetric cryptography, sometimes called public key cryptography, two words for the same name, and hash functions, which we haven't talked about yet. So let's touch on these. So how is hashing or a hash function different from encryption? Well, encryption is a two-way function. What is encrypted can be decrypted with the proper key. Hashing, on the other hand, is a one-way function that scrambles plain text to produce a unique message digest. There's no way to reverse a hash if it's properly designed. Your password, when you log into a Windows system, your password is hashed. It's stored as a hash in memory. And when systems share your password back and forth as you authenticate, your password is always hashed. It's never passed in clear text in modern scenarios. So common uses of encryption. So how are different algorithm types used? Well, I mentioned that symmetric encryption is typically used for bulk encryption, for encrypting large amounts of data. Symmetric encryption is quite fast. The challenge comes in securely transmitting that key to share it between the sender and the recipient. Asymmetric encryption is used for distribution of symmetric encryption keys, that shared key. Asymmetric encryption is used in identity authentication via digital signatures and certificates. It's used for non-repudiation services and key agreements. So non-repudiation means identifying an entity in an undeniable way. In the scenario of a message or a value being transmitted securely, non-repudiation makes the sender's identity undeniable. and hash functions. So hash functions are used in verification of digital signatures, generation of pseudo-random numbers, and integrity services like data integrity and authenticity. For example, in transmitting a file, the sender can create a hash of that file and send that hash along with the file, and the recipient can then go ahead and create a hash of the file they receive, and if the hash matches the hash shared by the sender, they know the data has arrived intact and unaltered. You're expected to be familiar with Microsoft's 6 core privacy principles for the exam. The first of these is control. Microsoft aims to put customers in control in determining what data is collected about them and with whom it's shared, and to be transparent with customers about data collection and use so everyone can easily make informed decisions about what data they choose to share. Microsoft aims to protect data entrusted to them using strong security and encryption, and to enact strong legal protections respecting local privacy laws and fighting for legal protection of privacy as a fundamental human right. Microsoft promises no content-based targeting, so not using email, chat, files, and other personal content to target advertising. And to ensure that when Microsoft does collect data, it's used to your benefit, the customer, and to make your user experience better. In short, I think Microsoft is really just trying to be ethical, but you have here 6 core principles. You'll be expected to be familiar with all of them. And you'll need to get familiar with the Service Trust Portal. We'll look at this briefly. It's quite easy. This is a portal that provides a variety of content, tools, and other resources about Microsoft security, privacy, and compliance practices. There's actually a shortcut URL. It's aka.ms/STP, as in Service Trust Portal. The Service Trust Portal includes resources like audit reports from ISO, NIST, SOC, FedRAMP, and many other regulatory standards, data protection resources, white papers, risk assessment tools, compliance guides, Azure security and compliance blueprints. We'll talk about blueprints later, and basically guidance for several industry verticals, actually. The key word here is lots of resources that are going to be useful in implementing security in your organization or your customers. Actually, let's just go have a look at the Service Trust Portal. So when you put in that shortcut URL, it takes you to servicetrust.microsoft.com, and you'll see here you can find trust documents. You can go to the Trust Center, access all sorts of resources. So if I just scroll down here, we see those audit reports I mentioned. Before your security team goes through the pen testing process with Azure, you can come to the Service Trust Portal and look at the pen test already conducted at Microsoft's request by independent third-party pen testing companies. You'll find Azure blueprints here. Here are the links to white papers, FAQs, and compliance guides. That's really what you need to know about the Service Trust Portal for the SC-900 exam. And on to Objective Domain 2, which is describe the capabilities of Microsoft Identity and Access Management Solutions. So the sub-objectives here: define identity principles and concepts, describe the basic identity services and identity types of Azure AD, describe the authentication capabilities of Azure Active Directory, describe access management capabilities of Azure AD, and finally describe the identity protection and governance capabilities of Azure AD. So let's start with a look at traditional architecture versus zero trust architecture. So traditionally, the perimeter of the network is the firewall. The network security perimeter surrounds the organization. Everything in the trusted network inside the firewall is trusted. Everything outside the firewall, untrusted. And when we compare that alongside zero trust architecture, where identity is the perimeter, our mobile workforce, workers working from home, bringing their own devices, all of these items, cloud services, cloud apps, everything is untrusted by Default security is based on identity, not on a network perimeter. So in that case, if we visualize that another way, we see our identity and our apps and data, mobile devices, personal devices, hybrid cloud resources, vendors and contractors all lie outside that perimeter, so trust must be earned and compliance must be proven. So when a user authenticates, generally speaking, multi-factor authentication is applied. We may use conditions of access to make sure that user is coming from a known location, perhaps even using a compliant device, a device that the organization is managing that is known to meet the organization's standards. So auth-in and auth-z, so authentication and authorization. So authentication is the process of proving that you are who you say you are. And authorization is the act of granting an authenticated party permission to do something. So we have authentication, which is basically proving identity, and then authorization, which is the granting of access. Identity providers. So an identity provider creates, maintains, and manages identity information while providing authentication services to applications. And when sharing apps and resources with external users, Azure Active Directory is the default identity providers. When we're thinking about identity providers, the key phrases here are managing identity information while providing authentication services. Active Directory. So this would also be called Active Directory Domain Services. This is a set of directory services developed by Microsoft all the way back in Windows 2000 for on-premises domain-based networks. So Active Directory gives organizations the ability to manage multiple on-premises infrastructure components and systems using a single identity per user. However, Active Directory having been developed so long ago, it doesn't natively support mobile devices, SaaS, or line of business apps that require modern authentication. It was developed long before all those things. So remember, Active Directory is a set of directory services designed for on-premises and using a single identity per user. So, and not supporting modern authentication. Again, that's just a matter of when the solution was developed. If you hear Forest, domain, LDAP, Kerberos, or replication, those are generally terms that you'll hear when discussing Active Directory. And Active Directory on-premises, also called Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS. So just keep those in your head for the exam. So let's talk about the concept of federated services or a federated identity model. So federation is a collection of domains that have an established trust. And that level of trust might vary, but typically it includes authentication and almost always includes authorization as well. So again, proving identity and granting access. Often includes a number of organizations that have established trust for shared access to a set of resources. An example of this would be you federate with your on-premises environment with Azure AD, and you use this federation for authentication and authorization. In fact, this is the most common federated identity model that I've seen implemented in production. And this sign-in method ensures that all user authentication occurs on premises. It also allows administrators to implement more rigorous levels of access control. And in recent years, the primary drivers of federated identity were the more rigorous levels of access control. So for example, certificate authentication, key fob, or special card tokens. So let's look at an example here. So we have a website that uses identity provider A, and we have a user that authenticates to identity provider B. And identity provider A has a trust relationship configured with provider B. So when the user's credentials are passed to the website trusts the user and allows access. So with federation, we can have providers that are in the cloud or on premises or a combination of those, as we mentioned earlier with Azure AD and then on-premises Active Directory, where the authentication through federation always happens on premises with with Active Directory, but with Federation, trust is not always bidirectional. Although identity provider A may trust B and allow the user in domain B to access the website, the reverse wouldn't necessarily be true. So a real common example of federation in practice is when you use your social identity to log into a third-party website. For example, using your Twitter or Facebook account. So Twitter is an identity provider and the third-party site might be using a different identity provider like Azure AD, and there's a trust relationship between the two. So in this example, it could easily be Twitter and Azure AD. So that trust allows access without the need for the user to have an identity over there with identity provider A. You're expected to be familiar with common identity attacks for the exam, and a couple of these will look familiar from Objective Domain 1 from the Common Threats discussion. So dictionary attacks, where a program uses a built-in dictionary attempting all dictionary words to find that correct password, hoping a user has basically picked a word out of the dictionary. We have brute force, which is an attack that attempts to break the password trying all possible key combinations and variations. Brute force really depends on password complexity and compute power as far as how successful that sort of attack will be. More compute power can try more combinations more quickly, essentially. And then there's a password spray attack, which attempts to match a username against a list of weak passwords. Azure AD's global banned password list can really help protect against that. And of course, you have configuration capabilities within Azure AD to establish standards for password length, complexity, and age, so that can be easily avoided, and not to mention smart lockout. We'll talk about some of those a few slides ahead in this session. Phishing attacks are far and away one of the most prevalent attacks on identity out there, and one of the most successful. So phishing is commonly used to try to trick users into giving up personal information like a user account and a password by enticing them to click a malicious link or open a malicious attachment. There are multiple types of phishing attacks. Increasingly common these days are spear phishing attacks, which target specific groups of users where the bad actor has done some research on their target, and so they've created a malicious email that looks more legitimate based on the type of business that the organization engages in, for example. And then there's whaling, which targets high-level executives, so just a phishing attack that targets an executive, and again, that's going to tend to be more targeted than a run-of-the-mill phishing attack. And then there's even vishing, which uses voice technologies. The best defenses are really user education and Defender, Microsoft Defender for Office 365. And in fact, let's just look at that right quick here. So if I go to Microsoft 365 Defender, which is at security.microsoft.com, I can go down here to policies and rules, and here I will see where I can configure policies to protect my organization from phishing attacks. So anti-phishing attacks, for example, here there's a default policy that you'll find in place for protecting against phishing. And we also have safe attachments and safe links, which actually redirect all your safe links. So safe links will redirect any link clicked on by a user to a detonation chamber where it can be evaluated to make sure that it is in fact safe. Safe attachments will detonate attachments in a detonation chamber and basically examine them to ensure that they are not malicious. And you see anti-malware and anti-spam capabilities, but Microsoft Defender for Office 365, you're bringing these anti-phishing, safe attachments, and safe links in particular really stand out as great tools in preventing phishing attacks. And just by the by, you'll also see attack simulation training here, where you can actually simulate phishing attacks within your organization, which lead directly into training, a learning opportunity for users who are fooled by the attack simulation. So that's built into Microsoft 365 Defender. You're expected to be familiar with Azure Active Directory for the exam. So Azure AD is Microsoft's cloud-based identity and access management service that helps your users sign in and access resources like your internal resources, your apps on the corporate network or your custom cloud apps, or external resources like Microsoft 365, the Azure portal, and potentially hundreds of SaaS applications. You need to be familiar with Azure AD identities for the exam, so let's talk through the identity types here. So we'll start with a user, which is a representation of something that's managed by Azure AD. Specifically, employees and guests are represented as users in Azure AD, be those internal users in your directory or external guests represented in Azure AD. You have a service principal, which is a security identity used by applications or services to access specific Azure resources. You have a managed identity, which is an identity automatically managed in Azure AD, so really kind of a service principal that's automatically managed. There is a system assigned identity that's created for and tied to a specific resource. So for example, with an Azure VM, I can specify that a system assigned managed identity is created, which can be used by the VM to authenticate to specific resources. When the virtual machine is deleted, that system assigned identity is also deleted. Its life cycle is tied to the resource to which it is dedicated. And maybe we need to use a managed identity across multiple resources, so basically create once and manage independently. We could use a user assigned managed identity, which is a standalone Azure resource with its own lifecycle. So where supported, Microsoft recommends system assigned managed identity because they are the least amount of work, because the lifecycle is managed for you, essentially. So moving on, let's talk about devices. So a device is a piece of hardware like a mobile device, a laptop, a server, or a printer, which can be set up in different ways in Azure AD, depending on our circumstances. So Azure AD registered, for example, so devices can be Windows 10, iOS, Android, or Mac OS. These are often personal or BYOD devices. So really the goal of Azure AD registered devices is to provide your users with support for bring your own device or mobile device scenarios, in fact. And then we have Azure AD Join, where these devices exist only in the cloud. Azure AD Join devices are owned by an organization and signed in with their account. The key here is only in the cloud. So Azure AD Join is intended for orgs that are managing that device that they own and they want to be cloud first or cloud only. And then we have the third option, which is hybrid Azure AD Join. So in this case, devices can be Windows 7, 8.1, or 10, or Windows Server 2008 or newer. They're owned by an organization and signed in with an Active Directory Domain Services account. So Active Directory Domain Services, remember, is your on-premises directory services. So for hybrid organizations that are using Active Directory and also using Azure AD, the hybrid Azure AD Join option is the go-to solution. But the key there for hybrid, remember, it can exist on-prem or in the cloud, and Active Directory Domain Services is involved. So hybrid identity. So in a hybrid identity scenario, if we just take this to a high level, we have our on-premises Active Directory, we have our users and devices, and then we have our Office 365, Azure, and Azure AD, and all of our SaaS apps in the cloud. We use Azure AD Connect to synchronize our identities between Active Directory and Azure AD. We can synchronize the password, so when the user resets their password in the cloud, it's automatically synced back to on-premises, allowing a user single sign-on, whether they're accessing resources in the cloud or they're accessing resources on premises. And I don't expect you're going to see the nitty-gritty details of all of your configurable options for hybrid identity, because this is, after all, a fundamentals exam. Do be familiar with Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync is basically a cloud service alternative to the Azure AD Connect software, and it was made generally available not too long ago. Just know that fundamentally it does the same thing as Azure AD Connect. It's just a newer offering from Microsoft. Okay, we need to talk about external identity types. There are actually two types of external identities. So with B2B collaboration, it basically allows you to share your org's applications and services with guest users from other organizations while maintaining control over your own data. So it uses an invitation and redemption process, basically allowing external users to access your resources with their credentials. It allows you to put a nice boundary around how you'll collaborate with another organization, what SharePoint site they can get to, what resources they have access to. This is designed to work with Azure AD accounts, so the work accounts of another organization. And then you have B2C access management, so B2B business to business, B2C business to consumer. So Azure AD B2C is a customer identity access management solution, also perhaps called a consumer identity access management solution. So it allows external users to sign in with their preferred social, enterprise, or local account identities to get single sign-on with your app. So this would be the social personal identities option. You'll need to be familiar with some core identity services in Azure. So single sign-on, MFA, and Azure AD conditional access are all on the list that may come up on the exam. First, I'd like to talk for a moment, though, about role-based access controller, RBAC. So in Azure RBAC helps you manage who has access to Azure resources, what they can do with those resources, and which resources they have access to. But it's built on Azure Resource Manager, and it gives us fine-grained access management for Azure resources. It's one element of implementing least privilege in your environment. So assigning minimum required privilege. So let's talk about self-service password reset, which is a feature of Azure AD that allows users to change or reset their password without administrator or help desk involvement. So it supports password change when a user knows their password but wants to change it to something new. Password reset when a user can't sign in, like when they've forgotten their password. And then password unlock when a user can't sign in because their account is locked out. So it supports the change, reset, and unlock scenarios. And essentially this saves time and money and improves productivity and security because we're taking the help desk out of the equation so the user can self-correct in less time with less effort and saving us that help desk call. So also in the password protection and management category, we have the global banned password list, which is a list with known weak passwords, and it's automatically updated and enforced by Microsoft. It's actually maintained by the Azure AD Identity Protection team. When we talked about password spray attacks earlier in this session, I mentioned that we would talk about the global banned password list, which prevents users from setting weak passwords, which gives us protection against password spray. So custom banned password lists allow you to create organization-specific password ban lists. So these should be focused on org-specific terms, and these are going to protect against password spray, blocking all the known weak passwords, as we mentioned. And it provides hybrid security because it can integrate with Azure AD password protection with an on-premises Azure AD Directory Services environment when we're synchronizing with Azure AD Connect or Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. And single sign-on. So single sign-on means a user doesn't have to sign into every application they use. Essentially, they can log in once and that credential is used for multiple apps. And single sign-on based authentication systems are often called modern authentication system. So let's talk multi-factor authentication, or MFA. So Azure AD MFA works by requiring two or more of the following authentication methods. In fact, first let's step back and just talk about MFA at a high level. So MFA consists of something you know, like a PIN or a password, something you have, like a trusted device, like your mobile phone managed by the company, for example, and something you are, like biometric, like your fingerprint. And with Azure AD MFA, we can use the Authenticator app from Microsoft as our secondary factor, or we can use a voice call or an SMS or text message, although SMS is strongly discouraged due to vulnerabilities there. It's been breached before, so this would be kind of your last resort, really. Or we can use an oath token. So don't confuse oath with OAuth. So oath is the initiative for open authentication. So let's talk about Windows Hello for Business. So this is an authentication feature built into Windows 10. It replaces passwords with strong two-factor authentication on PCs and mobile devices. So essentially it allows users to authenticate to a Microsoft account, an Active Directory account, an Azure AD account, identity provider services, or relying party services that support fast ID online, so FIDO authentication. Really, you have two flavors of Windows Hello. You have Windows Hello, which is for personal devices and uses a PIN or a biometric gesture. And then you have Windows Hello for Business that always uses key-based or certificate-based authentication. And this is considered much more secure than the convenience, PIN solution. So Azure AD conditional access. This is used by Azure Active Directory to bring signals together to make decisions and enforce organizational policies. It essentially improves security by enforcing conditions of access. And let me just explain what I mean by that. So in the Azure AD conditional access policy scenario, we can consider all of the conditions around access. The signals being the user, the location, the device they're on. Is it a trusted device? What application are they attempting to access our corporate data with? Is it a trusted application? And real-time risk, assuming we have Azure AD identity protection. We'll talk more about this real-time risk element in just a moment. But those conditions, those signals can be considered. And based on those factors, we can allow access, we can require multi-factor authentication, or we can block access. And assuming we verify all of those requirements in our policy and the user passes, they get access to our apps and data. Let's just have a quick look at an Azure AD conditional access policy. So I'm in the portal, portal.azure.com. I'll go to Azure Active Directory. And under here, I will find security, and under security, conditional access, and here I can see a number of policies. So I'll look at require MFA for Microsoft 365 admins. So in considering the conditions of access, I can apply this policy to specific users and groups. So I select the select users and groups option, and in this case, I'm applying this to directory roles. So when someone logs in with specific privileged roles, they will be required to provide that second factor of authentication. And you'll see here I can apply this to a specific group, in this case Microsoft 365 administrators. So I'm doing this for the groups and for selected roles. I'm applying this in the case of all cloud apps, so anytime they're trying to access our admin resources. I'll look under conditions here, and if I go down to client apps, you'll see I'm going to enforce this when they're in a browser or mobile apps or desktop clients, so basically all the time. And I'll come down here and look at my grant, and you see here I am requiring multi-factor authentication. I could select multiple factors here, and you'll notice for multiple controls I can require all of the selected controls, or I can require any one of these. So for example, I could say a user needs to have a compliant device or a device that's hybrid Azure AD joined, or else they get a multi-factor prompt, for example. So if the user doesn't have a device, then they give me additional certification, additional confidence by providing that second factor of authentication. So, Azure AD roles are used to control permission to manage Azure AD resources. So we support built-in and custom roles in Azure AD. So there are many built-in roles out of the box, some of which are global and some of which are service specific. So many services within Azure have specific roles that support delegation of administration for a specific service, such as Azure Key Vault, for example. But at the same time, we have global Azure AD roles, such as global contributor, global reader, that will allow for granting a permission perhaps throughout an entire subscription. And these enable enforcement of least privilege. So this is another tool in the toolbox for enforcing least privilege, because we can assign the role that provides the permissions needed for the user to perform the tasks associated with their jobs. You can even create custom roles in Azure AD. Custom roles, however, require Azure AD Premium P1 or P2 license. And be that neither here nor there, most organizations that are leveraging Microsoft 365 already have Azure AD Premium or P1 or P2 anyway. So let's have a quick look at built-in and custom roles. So I'll just go back to the Azure portal. So I'll start back on the portal.azure.com homepage here, and I'll click on Azure Active Directory, and I'll click on Roles and Administrators, and here we can see all of the built-in roles that we see in Azure AD. And you'll notice that there are some service-specific roles like Exchange Administrator, Exchange Recipient Administrator, but then some of those global roles I mentioned, Global Reader, for example, Global Administrator. And you'll also notice up here the new custom role. So I can define a custom Azure AD role where circumstances make it advantageous. So what is identity governance? Well, identity governance addresses four key questions. Which users should have access to which resources? What are those users doing with that access? Are there effective organizational controls in place for managing that access? And can auditors verify that the controls are working? You may see questions on the exam around entitlement management, and Azure AD Entitlement Management is an identity governance feature that enables organizations to manage their identity and access lifecycle at scale. Essentially, they can automate access request workflows, assigning access to users, access reviews to see if users still need that access, as well as automating expiration of access if need be. What you can do is simply add resources like groups, teams, apps, and SharePoint sites in the entitlement management feature to an access package, a single package that contains everything that, say, a new employee in a specific role would need to get started, or that would be required for onboarding a new member of a project team. And then when you've added those resources to the package, you can specify permissions for each resource by selecting a role from the drop-down list. And you can store all these resources and access packages in a container called a catalog. And you can delegate access to that catalog to allow the appropriate department member or team member to manage that, so it doesn't become a forever administrator problem. So let's talk about access reviews. So access reviews in Azure AD ensure only the right people have access to resources. Basically, we can eliminate excessive rights due to changes in job roles and project status, etc., by reviewing access on a periodic basis, maybe quarterly, for example. What we can do here is create access reviews for teams or group membership, as well as application access. And you do want to make sure not to confuse the access reviews feature with the access reviews that take place within privileged identity management. So privileged identity management. So this is a service in Azure AD that enables you to manage, control, and monitor role access. So it's role focused. I want you to remember that. It includes resources in Azure AD, Azure, and other Microsoft online services like Microsoft 365 or Intune. It basically mitigates the risks of excessive, unnecessary, or misused access permission by requiring justification for privileged role activation. So privileged identity management does require Azure AD Premium P2. So continuing on with PIM. So what functionality does this give us? Well, it gives us just-in-time access by providing access through privileged roles only when needed and not before. And it's time-bound access by assigning start and end dates and times that indicate when a user can access the resource. And it can be approval-based if we want, so we can require specific approval. So the user can request role activation. For example, a user can request activating the global administrator role that they're eligible for, and if we would like to put approval into that process, we can do that, so someone else has to approve the request. Otherwise, we can simply have an email go out to other admins letting everyone know, hey, user X activated their privileged global administrator access. But this gives us visibility because it sends notification when the privileged roles are accessed, and it's auditable because there's a full access history that you can download. And in the world of security and regulatory requirements, an audit trail is an aspect of due care. It's important. So let me just quickly show you where to find privileged identity management in case you're not familiar. So I'll go to Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal here, and under Identity Governance, when I click on Identity Governance here, it'll take you just a moment to come up. I'll see Privileged Identity Management. I can click on Azure AD Roles, and you'll see here I can configure my Privileged Identity Management feature. But notice here that I can configure the roles. I can also review access. I can create access reviews that will actually allow users to tell me if they still require that access. So I can actually make even the auditing of the continued need for the capability to elevate, to activate a privileged role, to elevate permissions, to determine if a user still needs that. So I could create quarterly access reviews, for example. Users get an email, they're asked to confirm that they need that continued access or they no longer need that, and I can take action based on those results. But just-in-time, time-bound, and approval-based if desired. And remember, role-focused. PIM focuses on roles. So Azure AD Identity Protection. So this is a tool that allows organizations to accomplish 3 tasks. They can automate the detection and remediation of identity-based risks. So they can identify user risk and identify risky access attempts. So, and we can investigate risks using data in the portal. We can even export risk detection data to third-party utilities for further analysis. So perhaps just as importantly in my mind, it enables consideration of risk in Azure AD conditional access. So when we were walking through that earlier, I mentioned that the evaluation of risk requires Azure AD identity protection. And it uses the following signals to calculate risk. It'll look at atypical travel, anonymous IP address, unfamiliar sign-in properties like unfamiliar country, for example, unfamiliar device, sign in from a malware-linked IP, leaked credential, password spray, Azure AD threat intelligence. And again, this one also requires Azure AD Premium Plan 2. So like Privileged Identity Management, identity protection is also a feature of that Azure AD Premium P2 level. And again, in Azure AD Conditional Access, we only get that real-time risk evaluation if we have Azure AD Identity Protection in place. And that's a wrap for Domain 2. Now we're on to Objective Domain 3, which is describe the capabilities of Microsoft Security Solutions. And within Objective Domain 3, we have some subheadings. We have describe basic security capabilities in Azure, describe security management capabilities in Azure, describe security capabilities of Azure Sentinel, and describe threat protection with Microsoft 365 Defender. Next, we have describe security management capabilities of Microsoft 365 and describe endpoint security with Microsoft Intune. So let's dig into these. We'll start with network security groups. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny inbound traffic to or outbound traffic from several types of Azure resources. So you'll find that for each rule you can specify a source and a destination port, so source port, destination port, and protocol. And you can have inbound and outbound rules, and you can apply a network security group to a subnet or a network adapter. Sometimes you'll hear a network adapter called a NIC. Let's just take a quick look at a network security group in the Azure portal. So I'm in the properties of a virtual machine, and from the overview screen, if I just go down under settings, I can go to networking, and I see here the network security group is mentioned, and it tells me where this network security group is attached. You'll see here it's mentioned that it's attached to network interface because an NSG can be attached to remember, a network adapter or a subnet. Generally, we see them attached to a subnet. You can even have them attached to both, meaning I can have a virtual machine that has an NSG that's attached to the NIC, and another NSG can be attached to the subnet, in which case we'll need to look to see what our effective rules are across both of those. And we'll see effective security rules here that will show us what those are. Now, this VM is not running, but what we would see here are the effective inbound and outbound rules based on whether we have an NSG attached to the NIC or the subnet, or in our case, both. And you'll notice here that if I just look at the inbound rules in the NSG that's attached to the NIC, you'll notice that there's a little warning here because I have the RDP port open to the internet. And the rules are listed in priority, so the lower that number, the higher the priority. And at the end, you have that deny all inbound. That's a catch-all. If nothing else, no other rules match above. Some people ask me, is this like a firewall? And the answer is really no. It's more, I'd say it's closer to allow deny rules that you'd see on like a Cisco router, for example. It's not a stateful scenario. So Azure DDoS. So Azure DDoS is a feature that provides DDoS mitigation features to defend against distributed denial of service attacks. That's DDoS. Now the standard tier provides enhanced mitigation features. So let's pay attention to this with me here. It also includes logging, alerting, and telemetry that's not included in the free basic tier that's present by default. There's a free tier of Azure DDoS that's simply present, and you don't have to do anything to enable it or configure it. It's simply there. Azure Firewall. Now, Azure Firewall is a managed cloud-based network security service that protects your virtual network resources. It's a fully stateful firewall as a service. It has built-in high availability and unrestricted cloud scalability. In fact, you don't need to configure additional virtual network appliances to establish your scale limitations. Scalability is built into the service. And although it's not mentioned in the skills measured, it's worth mentioning that Azure Firewall Manager enables central management of multiple Azure Firewall instances across regions and subscriptions. Next up is Azure Bastion, which is a fully managed PaaS service that provides RDP and SSH access to your VMs directly through the Azure portal, and it requires no public IP and no RDP client. So the keys here, directly through the portal, no public IP, and no RDP client. That's your value proposition there. So if you see any questions around remote access, that's what you're looking for if the answer is Azure Bastion. Web App Firewall, or WAF. This provides centralized protection of your web apps from common exploits and vulnerabilities, And the WAF on an application gateway is based on the core rule sets from OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. And with this rule set, with these rule sets, the WAF automatically updates to include protection against new vulnerabilities with no additional configuration needed. These rule sets are going to protect against the common attacks that are detailed by OWASP, for example, like SQL injection attacks and cross-site scripting. And these rule sets that you can easily apply right out of the box are what make that web app firewall so powerful. You have best practices from a trusted organization right out of the gate. The exam will test your knowledge of the ways data is encrypted in Azure. So we have Azure Storage Service Encryption, which protects data at rest in Azure storage by automatically encrypting before persisting data to the disk, whether that's Azure Disks, Blob Storage, Azure Files, or Storage Queue. But encryption is enabled by default in Azure Storage. There's Azure Disk Encryption. So this helps us encrypt Windows and Linux IaaS VM disks. So for Windows, it uses BitLocker. For Linux, it uses dmcrypt. And it will protect OS and data disks. Not on by default, we need to check that box and enable that encryption. So transparent data encryption focuses on protecting data in Azure SQL Database and Azure Data Warehouse against malicious activity using real-time encryption and decryption of not only your database but your backups and your transaction logs at rest and without requiring app changes, and incidentally without having any discernible impact on performance. Transparent data encryption's actually been around for quite a long time, and it's available in SQL servers on premises as well, by the by. If you get questions around protecting secrets, Key Vault is quite likely going to be your answer. So Azure Key Vault is a cloud service for centralized, secure storage and access for application secrets. And a secret is really anything that you want to tightly control access to, be that an API key, a password, a certificate, a token, some form of cryptographic key. Key Vault is the place where we're going to store that. Next up is Azure Security Center, which is a unified infrastructure security management solution that strengthens our security posture and provides guidance. And it really strengthens our posture by providing guidance for compute, data, storage, app, and other services. So it's infrastructure focused, really. And there's no guarantees what's going to show up on the exam, but infrastructure is one of those trigger words you want to look for. Unified Infrastructure Security Management. So let's talk about Azure Secure Score, which is an analytics tool that answers the question, how secure is my workload? So the main goals of Secure Score are visualization of your security posture, so giving you some sort of red, yellow, green visualization of your current state. Fast triage and suggestions that give you meaningful ways to take action to improve your posture. And then measurement of that workload security over time. It's really focused on cloud infrastructure, what we see in Azure Security Center. Now, fast triage and suggestions really focuses on not only the suggestions, but the fast triage refers to the quick fix option you'll see for many fixes where you have kind of a single push button solution to implement the recommended improvement. Visualization of the posture, we get a score, we get a dial, we get a list of deviations from best practices, and measurement really comes not only in the form of the overall secure score, but you'll see the points level impact in each of the changes that are recommended for improving your security posture. But Secure Score is going to constantly review active recommendations and calculate your score based on those. And the score of a recommendation is derived from its severity and security best practices. And it's calculated based on, the overall score is calculated based on the ratio between your healthy resources and your total resources. So if you want to improve your score, implement the recommendations. It's as simple as that. We do need to be careful not to implement recommendations that might impact production, but generally speaking, you're going to find a lot of quick wins in those recommendations that will improve your posture with little or no risk. And now let's talk about security baselines for Azure, which we'll see in Azure Security Benchmark. So a baseline is an implementation of the benchmark of the individual Azure service. These recommendations are developed by Microsoft Cybersecurity Group and the Center for Internet Security. So CIS is a non-profit. It's not a Microsoft organization. It's a non-profit organization opened all the way back in 2000 that's focused on developing and communicating security best practices. And they build and lead communities to drive that information out to the world, to the community. So Benchmark focuses on cloud-centric control areas like network security, identity management, posture and vulnerability management, and endpoint security. Now, when we look at that Azure Security Benchmark feature, it appears under regulatory compliance in Azure Security Center. So you'll see some terms you want to be familiar with. So a control is a high-level description of a feature or an activity that needs to be addressed. It's not specific to a technology. You have a benchmark, which contains security recommendations for a specific technology. So it takes that control and translates it to something technologically specific. And then we have a baseline, which is an implementation of the benchmark. So to state that another way, a control is expressed as a benchmark. A benchmark is implemented through a baseline. And Microsoft has developed many security baselines for you. I'll show you where to find the Azure Security Benchmark documentation so you can have a look through those baselines before the exam. Security Center has a couple of pillars of functionality that are called out in the skills measured we want to talk about. There's Cloud Security Posture Management, which are features like Secure Score, detection of security misconfigurations, and of course the recommendations that go with those from our Azure workloads and asset inventory. This is by and large free tier functionality in Security Center. And then we have Cloud Workload Protection Platform. This is that Azure Defender functionality that brings advanced intelligent protection of not only Azure workloads but hybrid resources. We can reach into on-premises virtual machines, for example, and other workloads. This is standard tier functionality. You're going to pay something for this, generally speaking. And it protects a number of different workloads. It'll touch servers, including VMs, app service, storage, SQL, Kubernetes, Azure Key Vault, Azure Container Registry, Resource Manager, DNS, open source Azure DBs. There's even in the standard tier, in that tier you pay for, functionality where we can enable a Qualys scan of our VMs and of SQL in our Azure VMs. And you can also add regulatory standards like NIST, Azure CIS, and actually quite a few others to give you a more customized view of your organization's regulatory and compliance obligations and your state against those standards. So let's go have a look at a couple of things here. So I want to start by just showing you where to find documentation on the Azure Security Benchmark. So if you just search for Azure Security Benchmark documentation, you can find this landing page where they're actually categorized by the type of security baselines they are. Now let's pop over to the Azure portal and have a look at Security Center. So I'm just at portal.azure.com and click on Security Center. So from the overview page, you see I have cards that will take me directly to specific features. I can get to those features from this menu in the middle here as well. So let's take a look at Secure Score for a start. So when I click on the Secure Score, I'm going to see what's under management. I can see my overall score and I can view the recommendations. Now when I view the recommendations, I can see the potential increase in score. I can look at the specific recommendations under each category, like under the remediate vulnerabilities control. I can see exactly what they'd like me to do. In this case, they want me to enable the vulnerability assessment solution. And if I come over here, that little lightning bolt tells me there's a quick fix, that single click sort of capability to deal with that. You'll notice I can see Azure Security Benchmark right here because this is the default policy initiative for Azure Security Center. And if I just pop back to Security Center here, I can get to regulatory compliance. And when I get under regulatory compliance here, you'll notice I can manage compliance policies. And when I come in here, I can click on to say a specific subscription, and you'll notice here the regulatory standards that are being applied. So we see PCI DSS, ISO 27001, SOC TSP, and I can click on more standards and see additional standards that come right out of the box that allow me to select regulatory standards that are applicable to my organization, so I get that more specific, organization-specific view of compliance. And then also, let's just talk about how we turn on pricing on the standard tier, essentially, because when I click on Azure Defender, you'll notice that it tells me, hey, you don't have Defender enabled, and that's because it's a standard tier capability. So if I click on pricing and settings, I can see here that the Defender plan, the standard tier that costs money, is off. So if I come here and turn on Azure Defender, I can see the cost for the features related to each of those workloads and toggle those on or off, and it tells me how many instances I have, so I know what my cost is going to be per month ahead of time. So definitely worth exploring and worth getting familiar with, so you're ready should any questions come to you on the exam. But that standard tier functionality is really what we're looking at right here with Azure Defender. All right, so SIEM and SOAR. So SIEM is an acronym that stands for Security Information Event Management. So that's a system that collects data from many other sources within a network and then provides real-time monitoring, analysis, typically correlation and notification of potential attacks. So a SIEM is often ingesting information from network devices and syslog servers, and in Azure from cloud services like Azure Active Directory or Azure Activity Logs, any number of Microsoft and third-party services. And SOAR is a fairly new acronym we've seen pop up in the SIEM industry in recent years, and it stands for Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. So this is centralized alert and response automation, and Microsoft delivers that through threat-specific playbooks. And you can have response automation that's fully automated, or perhaps it's single click. But Microsoft delivers both of these capabilities together in Azure Sentinel. Azure Sentinel is the SIEM. The SOAR capability comes with help from Azure Logic Apps. And this is Microsoft's cybersecurity stack. So Azure Sentinel uses AI, machine learning, and threat intelligence, basically data coming from multiple sources, providing insights into entities out there and their potential threat, be those URLs, IP addresses, etc. Extended detection and response. So this is a fairly new acronym, XDR. This popped up in 2018, and this refers to solutions that integrate security visibility across the organization's broader infrastructure. So providing insights into not only endpoints, as we'd see with EDR, which is endpoint detection and response, but also into cloud infrastructure, mobile devices, apps, identities, data, you name it. And this supports proactive threat hunting and responding automatically to identified threats, at least on the Microsoft stack. So when we look at Defender for Endpoint, we see automated investigation capability. So EDR is focused on protecting the endpoint and providing in-depth visibility and threat prevention for a particular device or class of devices, namely the endpoint, where XDR takes a wider view, integrating security across endpoints, cloud computing, email, and a variety of other solutions. And to look at it another way, when we see integrates security, visibility, remember threat hunting and automated investigation, that's what we see in Defender for Endpoint. And this also leverages AI, machine learning, threat intelligence, so getting that signal related to entities out there in the world. Now I want to take a look at this statement here, provides visibility into endpoints, cloud infrastructure, mobile devices, apps, etc. Why is that important? Let me explain. So the reason XDR, the value XDR really adds is that broader perspective across our incidents. So when an incident is investigated, the scope with Microsoft Threat Protection, for example, is that it can investigate across identity data, endpoint data, app data, infrastructure data, and then our data sources. So the context of an investigation, if we're just looking at endpoints, we might look like we have an endpoint problem, but if we can take a step back and look at email data and identity data and endpoint data, we can get a better view into the path that malicious entity took in coming into our environment and the full scope of their activity, so we can really investigate the entire incident, not just one silo. But that's really the value of Microsoft Threat Protection, is it gives us visibility across all of that data. But when you see talk of XDR, you're going to see two solutions: Microsoft 365 Defender and Azure Defender. So Microsoft 365 Defender is really looking at endpoint data, app, email, cloud apps, where Azure Defender is focused more on hybrid cloud workloads and infrastructure, IoT devices, etc. But XDR is a capability of both Microsoft 365 Defender and Azure Defender. So the difference being is what aspects of your estate each focuses on. And we've already seen quite a bit about the workloads covered under Azure Defender. Let's talk a bit about Microsoft 365 Defender. First, I actually want to touch on Azure Sentinel with you. So Azure Sentinel is security information event management. So it provides visibility and context across all the silos: applications, identities, endpoints, and data. Sentinel has connectors bringing in data from more than 100 sources, and not just Microsoft sources. Certainly it can bring in your logs from Azure Active Directory and your Azure activity logs and security logs from your various endpoints. So it can get into your hybrid cloud infrastructure. It can consume syslog and common event format data. But all of that data is going to provide greater context into the scope of a security incident, because Sentinel leverages machine learning and threat intelligence to automatically root out and surface potential security incidents, and then through its SOAR capabilities, leveraging Azure Logic Apps to better and more quickly remediate potential incidents. So remember, when you see SIEM and SOAR, think Azure Sentinel. So let's talk about Microsoft 365 Defender. So when we think about Microsoft 365 Defender services, which is what one of the skills measured mentions, we're really talking about in the identity area, Microsoft Defender for Identity. When we think of endpoints, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Apps would be Microsoft Cloud App Security, or MCAS it's sometimes called. And for email and collaboration, Microsoft Defender for Office 365. So let's break these down so you understand what each of these does for the exam. So let's start with Defender for Identity. So this was formerly called Azure Advanced Threat Protection, and it's a cloud-based solution that leverages your on-premises Active Directory signal. So this is taking the logs from your on-premises Active Directory domain services. That's a key. And it's going to identify, detect, and investigate advanced threats, compromised identities, malicious insider action. So it's really focused on your identities and your endpoints and rooting out malicious activity and lateral movement, to be specific. But Defender for Identity requires on-premises Active Directory. It needs Active Directory domain services. So lock that in the back of your mind. So Microsoft Defender for Office 365. This used to be called Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. Office 365 ATP was the common acronym we saw. This protects your org against email-based threats, URL, and collaboration threats. So it includes a feature called Safe Links and one called Safe Attachments that will basically take the links in emails or Office documents, and it will rewrite those links so they can be redirected to a detonation chamber to ensure that they are not malicious, and attachments can be examined in that same detonation chamber. It's really a virtual environment, but the industry lingo tends to be detonation chamber. So the attachments can also be examined for potentially malicious content. And Defender for Office 365 includes anti-phishing protection as well as phishing attack simulation, so you can test your users' awareness. And one thing I think is really great about that anti-phishing attack simulation is that when a user gets caught, we can turn that into a learning opportunity to make our users more aware of what phishing attacks look like. So when you think about phishing, safe links, safe attachments, think Defender for Office 365. All right, Defender for Endpoint. So this used to be called Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection. This is an enterprise endpoint security platform that helps prevent, detect, and investigate advanced threats really focused on the endpoint. And originally this was only available on Windows 10. It was then expanded to other versions of Windows and then into the Linux world and into the mobile world. So the variety of endpoints that can be protected through Defender for Endpoint has grown significantly from when the service was first released years ago. And it includes EDR capability, that endpoint detection and response, attack surface reduction, automated investigations, and advanced hunting. That automated investigations and advanced hunting capability, very significant and one of the key elements that you want to remember for the exam. When you see automated investigations and advanced hunting, chances are they're talking about Defender for Endpoint. Incidentally, the center for Defender for Endpoint is built into Windows 10. You're really more or less toggling a switch to enable that capability on Windows 10. It was then expanded through various means to other types of endpoints. And then there's Microsoft Cloud App Security. So MCAS is what's called a Cloud Access Security Broker, or a CASB, which is designed to detect and stop shadow IT. So if you see the phrase shadow IT, the answer is Microsoft Cloud App Security, full stop. Now this provides visibility over data travel and analytics to identify threats not only over Microsoft services, but third-party cloud services. So we can connect MCAS to third-party storage providers like Box and Dropbox. We can connect MCAS to other clouds like AWS, for example. But it natively integrates with not only multiple Microsoft services and solutions, but third parties. And remember the key phrase, shadow IT. I'll actually just show you Microsoft Cloud App Security quickly so you have a bit of additional context. So I'm at portal.cloudappsecurity.com, and when you authenticate, it will automatically navigate you to your tenant. So when I go to the dashboard here, I can see alerts, I can see discovery data, recent discovery data. Now I will look at my cloud discovery dashboard. I can see apps that have been discovered. I can see risk that's been identified. And this is a lab environment, so we don't see a lot of applications and users, but you can see some data here to get a sense of what comes into the dashboard. Your discovered apps come either from the logs that are forwarded and ingested by Cloud App Security from your network devices, or from the telemetry in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So Cloud App Security can integrate with Defender for Endpoint. It can send its discovery data and alert data over to Azure Sentinel. And you see here that the discovered apps appear. They get a rating based on several dozen criteria, and the rating is from 1 to 10. And if you drill into the app, you can see how it was given that rating and where a particular app might have problems. And there are policies. You can create up to around 7 different types of policies. There are many policies that are created right off the shelf and will generate alerts in your Cloud App Security portal by default, and you can configure, of course, email notification, but you'll find quite a few policy templates here that give you a starting point so you can see how these are configured. And I'll go over here to the little gear icon and to settings. I want to show you how easy some of the integration is. So if I scroll down this menu and go to, for example, Defender for Endpoint, I can, beyond ingesting the signal data and telemetry from Defender for Endpoint, where I get information about the apps that are in use on my endpoints, regardless of where they're located. That's part of the magic, because now Cloud App Security has visibility into apps wherever those endpoints are located. They don't have to be in the corporate network. You'll notice I can enforce app access. So One of the capabilities of Cloud App Security is I can sanction or unsanction an app, meaning I can mark it as approved or disapproved for use. And if I unsanction an app, I can actually configure Defender for Endpoint to block any user's access to that application. So very powerful integration. And if I scroll down here to the threat protection section, you see Microsoft Defender for Identity integration. We see Azure AD Identity Protection integration. So we have a lot of capability for greater context in both directions, really. So we're really only scratching the surface in the time we have. But one more thing to look at before we go here. I'll click on the gear in the upper right. I'll select App Connectors, and I have a Connect an App menu item. And you'll see here I can connect Cloud App Security at the API level to other cloud platforms like AWS and Google Cloud Platform, to identity providers like Okta. I can connect into third-party cloud storage like Box and Dropbox and Google Workspace. And I point that out just to mention that Cloud App Security integrates natively with Microsoft 365's data classification service. So that will be interesting when we get into compliance and governance in Module 4. So moving on, we're going to talk about Microsoft 365 Security Center and what Microsoft 365 Security Center is exactly. It's really the new home for monitoring and managing security across your Microsoft 365 Defender services, which focus on identity, data, devices, and apps. And you can view the security health of our organization from the perspective of the Microsoft 365 services like Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Office 365, and Microsoft Cloud App Security Data. So it all comes together in a single portal to a fair degree, and that portal is at security.microsoft.com. So previously we talked about Azure Secure Score. Now we're going to talk about Microsoft Secure Score. And the purpose of Microsoft Secure Score is to help orgs improve their security posture for Microsoft 365 services. So the focus here is different. There are three distinct categories in this Secure Score. There's identity, which will be focused on your Azure AD accounts and roles, devices, which is Microsoft Defender for Endpoints, and apps, so email and cloud apps, including Office 365, and data from Cloud App Security. So you'll see all that come into this Secure Score. And the recommendations are sorted by potential impact to your score, much like Azure Secure Score, but this is Microsoft Secure Score. We'll also take a look at security reports and dashboards in Microsoft Security Center, and you'll see multiple categories, each with their own card. You'll see identity, which again are your Azure AD user accounts and credentials, a data category for email and document contents, devices, which is really endpoint focused, be that your Windows endpoints or your mobile devices, and then apps, your programs and attached online services. And finally, Microsoft 365 Security Center includes incident management functionality. So there's an incidents queue, and our incidents are a collection of correlated alerts created when a suspicious event is found. Alerts can be generated from a variety of different entities, including devices and users and mailbox entities, and they can come from many different domains, and the incident provides a comprehensive view and context of an attack. So it's giving us a full view across those silos, as we talked about previously. And your incident management queue allows you to manage all of your incidents in one place, regardless of the entity type that you're working with in the Microsoft 365 context. And your incidents are auto-assigned and named. That they can be updated, though. So let's take a quick look at the Microsoft 365 portal. Remember, it's at security.microsoft.com. And if we have a look here, right away here on the home page in the Security Center, we can see our Secure Score. We can click on the Improve Your Score button, which will take us to a list of improvement actions, which, as with Azure Secure Score, are sorted by their score impact. If I look at the product column, I can see where the change applies. I see lots of guidance around Azure Active Directory, Defender for Identity, Cloud App Security, Microsoft Teams. So clearly a different focus here with Microsoft Secure Score versus what we saw with Azure Secure Score. And if I look down through the cards here, I can see device compliance, I can see user risk, I can see device, I can see threats, and with many of these I can tell exactly where this information came from, but not always. So I see here 3 privileged OAuth apps. So this is telling me about apps for which consent has been granted that is high, unnecessarily high. And if I click Show More, it's going to take me directly to that. That happens to be Cloud App Security. So it'll open that up for me in the Cloud App Security portal directly, where I can potentially take action. And if I come over here in the left-hand menu, I can see the Incidents node, where I can look at my incident management queue. I can see the severity, and if I expand that, I can see the nature of the incident and drill down in there and look at more detail. I can see the impacted entities here, and you'll notice the detection source. This tells me where the incident came from, because different Microsoft 365 services can service incidents, based on the policies or rules or functionality and the entity types that they're watching. So I don't expect you're going to see the exam get deep in any area, and I don't expect you're going to need to know much about Microsoft 365 Security Center at great depth, but now you have a good idea of what sort of functionality rolls up there from Microsoft 365 Defender. So you'll need to know the answer to the question, what is Microsoft Intune for this exam? So Intune is a cloud-based service that focuses on mobile device management and mobile application management. We can manage multiple operating systems and device types with Intune, including Apple iOS and iPadOS, Android, Windows, and Mac OS. And we can also apply mobile application management, or MAM policies, that enable app-centric protection on personal devices in BYOD scenarios. So in other words, personal devices that the company does not fully manage. And with MAM, we can require a user, in order to access corporate data, uses managed apps like Outlook for mobile, like Word for mobile. And when they save data, they can save corporate data only to our approved repositories. We can restrict them to SharePoint and OneDrive, for example, prevent them from copying data from inside that corporate app and pasting it over into a personal app like Gmail. So we have tight control around our corporate data, and when the user no longer works for the company, there's no access to that data. But remember, MDM and MAM, and do park in the back of your mind the OSs and device types that Intune can manage in case that comes up on the exam. Endpoint security in Intune. So Intune has a number of policy types that we can use to manage our endpoints, from security baselines to endpoint security policies, device compliance, app-based conditional access. So that's Azure AD conditional access. And then integration with Defender for endpoint. So when you see device compliance, we can use Intune to establish what our rules are for device compliance, and then we can use that compliance state for that device in our Azure AD conditional access authentication criteria. So if we want to make sure that a user only accesses company resources from a compliant managed device, Intune can help us make that happen. So Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. So this is endpoint.microsoft.com, and it combines services like Intune, Configuration Manager, Desktop Analytics, Co-Management, and Windows Autopilot, all in a single interface. It's essentially the same user experience as when you're managing Intune, but you've got all this other functionality rolled in here into a single consolidated portal. So again, endpoint.microsoft.com. So let's quickly have a look at Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. So I'm at endpoint.microsoft.com. I'm at my starting point here, my dashboard. You see I have summary status of device enrollment, device compliance, configuration, client apps, so letting me know if there are any issues. Now if I just go to my left navigation menu here, if I click on devices, you'll notice here I can see some menus that would be fairly familiar to you if you're familiar with Intune. And if I drill down into Windows devices and I drill down into enrollment, for example, I see Windows Autopilot right here, so very similar to what I'd see in Intune. If I go to endpoint security, I can see here my different security policies. So I can, and folks like these endpoint security policies, I find, because they are function specific, right? I have antivirus, disk encryption, firewall, attack surface reduction. It's really easy to remember what we're configuring there. I mentioned conditional access policies we'll see from here. So I see the integration here with Azure AD conditional access. So really this is the present, now, and future for endpoint security and management. But again, high-level exam, so know what you'll find at Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. And for the big finish, we're ready for Objective Domain 4, describe the capabilities of Microsoft Compliance Solutions. So we're going to be talking compliance and we're going to be talking governance. So if we look at the subheadings under Objective Domain 4, we see describe compliance management capabilities in Microsoft 365, information protection and governance, insider risk, e-discovery, and audit. And then the last line item is describe resource governance capabilities in Azure. So lots of compliance, and we'll round it out with resource governance. So let's talk about Compliance Center. So this is your home for solutions related to information protection, information governance, insider risk management, discovery, and quite a lot more. So all of our information related compliance and governance is happening here. That portal is at compliance.microsoft.com. So hopefully you're seeing a pattern in the URLs here. They're very much descriptive of the function, and Microsoft's direction is really around consolidated portals for all of these functions. And we'll start with Compliance Manager, which is a solution that measures your progress in completing actions that help reduce risks around data protection and regulatory standards. And Compliance Manager includes hundreds of baselines for regulatory standards. They're called assessment templates. There are templates for GDPR, HIPAA, FINRA, NIST 800-53, many, many more. If you can name a regulatory standard, there's a good chance there's going to be a template in there for you. And that's also at the compliance.microsoft.com portal / compliance manager if you want to shortcut right to it. And when we look at that compliance score, which is part of Compliance Manager, it provides a roll-up of compliance based on assessment items within the assessment templates. So think of it as like a baseline that has specific assessment items that all roll up into the overall compliance score for the regulatory requirement we're deploying as an assessment. The score shows the organization's responsibilities, so the organization score versus Microsoft score on their responsibilities. That rolls up into the overall score, which makes your score, generally speaking, look abnormally high right out of the box. There are improvement actions that are shown. They're categorized as technical and operational. So one category that focuses on largely knobs you need to turn, configuration changes you need to make in your various cloud services and features, and then operational items that may be more related to processes, procedures, and documentation around that regulatory standard. And assessments include hundreds of items, so remediation might take many weeks or months as you work through those deficiencies. It's quite comprehensive, generally speaking. And your compliance score I mentioned looks quite high out of the box. Here's an example, and you can see here that your organization's points are quite low and the Microsoft points are quite high right out of the gate. So I want to take a look at Compliance Manager with you just briefly so you get a better sense of what Compliance Manager looks like. So I'll go to an existing Compliance Manager deployment. It takes 24 hours for your data to roll in the first time, so this one's been running for quite a while. If I look up here at the top of the screen, you'll notice the Improvement Actions tab. And if I click there, I get my improvement actions and the point that would be achieved by completing that task. And you'll notice here for the configuration item, it tells me not only the points achieved, it tells me the regulation I'm working with. So this will clue me in as to the assessment template I'm working with. So you see a lot of NIST 800-53. You'll see where the change needs to be made. So when we're looking at cloud services like Intune, you'll notice that the action type is technical in nature, right? And I have an assignment column there. I can make assignments to people for completing these tasks. And if I scroll down the list here, you'll see quite a large number. And when I look at some of the operational items, you'll see they're a bit more vague in their requests. So we see protect authenticator content. We see restrict access to private keys. So we can imagine we need to go in and take specific actions, but they're a little less specific than some of these technical remediations, these improvement actions that are more product focused. Now, if I go over to assessment templates, I mentioned there are hundreds of templates out of the box. If I just scroll down here, now you'll see there are some included templates. There are about 5 of those, which include ISO 27001, GDPR, NIST 800-53, but there are premium templates, which really refers to my licensing level in Microsoft 365. But if I just start scrolling here, you'll notice we're only to the C's, and we've been through dozens of templates already, so it's really quite extensive. So next up, we're going to talk about data classification. So admins can identify and protect sensitive information types with Microsoft 365, and there are dozens of built-in sensitive information types defined in patterns, in regular expressions, or with a function. In fact, around 100 last time I checked. And there are trainable classifiers for data that use artificial intelligence and machine learning to intelligently classify your data. These are handy with forms like contracts and invoices, so we can automate classification of specific document templates, for example. But we can automate this classification process in various ways. So you'll be expected to be familiar with Content Explorer and Activity Explorer. They're called out in the skills measured. So Content Explorer shows a snapshot of items that have a sensitivity label or a retention label applied or have been classified as a sensitive information type. So sensitivity or retention label. A sensitivity label is applied to a document that contains some type of sensitive data. Maybe it's banking information, maybe it's protected health information, maybe it's personally identifiable information like a social security number, or a retention label, which is something we use more in the records management area to mark documents that need to be retained for a period of time. We might have documents related to a legal action or related to a regulatory requirement where there is a mandatory retention period before that document is disposed of. And then there's Activity Explorer, which allows you to monitor what's being done with your labeled content through a historical view of activities on your labeled content. And basically, Content Explorer tells us what has been labeled or classified, and Activity Explorer tells us what is being done with labeled content. So kind of park that in the back of your mind for the exam. These appear under data classification in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. So I'll just show you quickly where to find Content Explorer and Activity Explorer. So I'm at compliance.microsoft.com, so I'm in the Compliance Center, and again, I'll click on Data Classification over here in the left-hand menu, and I'll find Content Explorer and Activity Explorer right here. So Content Explorer again shows us what's been labeled or classified. I pumped a bunch of documents in here, and you'll see that many sensitive information types have been flagged. So profanity, private IP addresses, lots of financial information, tax identification numbers, etc. I have my own custom classification here for Simon, one of our software products. But you see quite a lot that's been classified. And if I go over to Activity Explorer, I can see what's happening in terms of activity with these labeled documents. So, sensitivity labels. So I mentioned sensitivity labels are used in the labeling and protection of content. So these don't affect productivity or collaboration. We can decide on our labels and how to apply them to content like emails and documents. But think of sensitivity labels like different stamps that you can apply to a physical document. So when I have, say, a legal document, I can take a stamp and stamp the word legal confidential on there, right? So this is the electronic form of that. I can apply a sensitivity label to that document. But labeling is just the first step. So I classify my data by applying a sensitivity label, okay? And that's step one. It's really a two-step process. So sensitivity labels implement data classification. Label policies apply protection. Most organizations in the real world never get all the way through data classification, but know that you can classify and apply sensitivity labels without applying protection through label policies, which can restrict access. A fundamentals exam like this is not going to expect you to know the hands-on steps for creating and applying these labels and developing that strategy, but I wanted you to understand that sensitivity labels and label policies are separate concepts, and classification is the first step and protection is the second. So retention policies and retention labels may come up on the exam. So let's talk through the basics here. So retention policies are used to assign the same document retention settings to content at a site level or a mailbox level. And a single policy can be applied to multiple locations or to specific locations or users. Now, retention labels, on the other hand, are used to assign retention settings at an item level, like to a folder or a document or an email. And an email or document can have only a single retention label assigned to it at a time. But retention labels and retention policies help organizations to manage and govern information by ensuring content is only kept for a required time and then permanently deleted. So this can help companies comply with industry regulations and internal policies. Perhaps financial documents need to be retained for 7 years for a specific regulation, such as in the banking industry. And this can also reduce risk when there's litigation or a security breach, because keeping information around for an unnecessarily long period of time increases risk. When we have a security breach, there's more information to be stolen, and if we can get rid of information that's no longer needed, it reduces our risk profile. Destruction is actually the last phase of the information management lifecycle, and it is very important from a risk management perspective. But these are the basics of retention policies and retention labels, so you'll have that in mind for the exam. So let's talk about records management for a moment. So what is a record exactly in the first place? Well, records are often considered synonymous with documents, but records are different from a plain old document in one important way that makes them very unique. Records include evidence of a particular business activity, requiring them to be stored and retained over an extended period. So this means we need to specify a retention period and a disposition, which means what are we going to do with that document at the end of that retention period. Typically it's going to be a disposition review and then deletion, or maybe just deletion depending on the situation. But records management in Microsoft 365 supports disposition reviews, notifications, and reminders. So if we need somebody to look at information before it's deleted, we can set off that reminder and have the right qualified person review that information before disposing of it, just so we can confirm that deletion is appropriate and timely. If there's perhaps a reason it can't be deleted, perhaps there's ongoing litigation, then they can go in and apply a new retention policy. Or maybe when we get to a certain retention boundary or threshold, we can then move data over into an archive somewhere where it's less accessible. But if you're finding your way and still deciding where you want to focus in cybersecurity, data classification and protection, records retention and management, this is a big animal and you could spend a career in this space alone. So next up, we're going to talk about data loss prevention, sometimes abbreviated DLP. So data loss prevention is a way to protect sensitive information and prevent its inadvertent disclosure. We can identify, monitor, and automatically protect sensitive information across Microsoft 365. And there are DLP reports that show us content that matches our DLP policies. And these policies can be applied to Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, etc. But protecting sensitive information is what DLP is all about. Let me just explain at a high level how the DLP process works. So how policy evaluation works. So our content is created or changed. Maybe I create a document that contains sensitive financial information. So DLP uses a search to crawl new or changed content, and the search index is updated, and DLP policies query that search index, and then DLP policies take action on any result. So the delta, the new content that matches our policy, gets labeled appropriately. And there may be changes that result in a temporary difference between what we'd call Azure Information Protection and DLP, because DLP depends on that index and search process, where information protection, we're attaching a label to a document. Now we may be classifying that document and applying a sensitivity label automatically, but that label in information protection travels with that document everywhere. With DLP, the classification and labeling happens through this search and indexing process. So sometimes there can be a difference between how AIP sees it and DLP sees it. But behind the scenes, there is a unified sensitivity label, a unified data classification engine here. So DLP and information protection and Microsoft Cloud App Security, which can apply labels to documents that it discovers in transit or in third-party cloud repositories that it connects to. They all use the same data classification engine in Microsoft 365. So they're all sharing those same sensitivity labels. So we define these one time. But the way information protection works in labeling a document and the way DLP works can result in some temporary differences. Why don't I just show you a sensitivity label in data loss prevention quickly. So I'm back at the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, same place, and I'm going to go down to data loss prevention, and we'll look at our policies here. So we're going to look at a policy which goes through that process to label our data. So I'll look at U.S. financial data. So I'll edit this policy, and we will just step through its properties. So I see here that I can choose the locations to apply this policy. So I see Exchange email, SharePoint sites, and I can choose specific sites. So for example, this particular policy is applied to all sites, but I could include specific sites or exclude. I can get equally granular in my Exchange email selection for what I am including and excluding. So I'm just using all. You see I have Teams flagged here. I could also look over through Cloud App Security. I can apply this to on-premises repositories. So I have a lot of tuning capability. Then I set up my DLP rules. So this means that I'm defining the protection requirements for this policy. So when I hit Create Rule, I'm going to walk through and match conditions. And my conditions can be content contains, and then I can pick sensitive information types. So I can say the content contains these sensitive information types. And when I pick sensitive info types, I can choose from now over 200 sensitive information types you see here in Microsoft 365. So Microsoft has predefined these sensitive information types. I'll need to make sure that the type I choose matches my requirements, but I see some very standard sensitive information types that map to banking information like ARA routing number. I see tax number, passport number, medical number, and you'll notice that they are country specific. So if you're trying to establish DLP policies for a specific country, you can get down to built-in sensitive information types that are country specific. So I already have in this policy U.S. financial information, and you see that's turned on. I'm just going to look at the properties here. So it's looking for credit card number, bank account number, ABA routing number. I could customize this and add additional sensitive information types I like, and you notice I can also establish the instance count I need to find before I am confident that I'm appropriately flagging this document with the correct classification. So you see here high confidence means instance count 1 to 9. So basically if we see a credit card number is a credit card number. I need to see one time in order to be very confident. So it really depends on the situation, but you can tune your policy to your requirements. And if you find that you can't find your sensitive information type within those built-in types, you can create your own using regular expressions. And then I can test or turn on the policy. So if I want to test this out first, I can basically run this policy and then review the policy's impact. So basically the restrictions won't be enforced. If I turn it on right away after the policy is created, it'll take up to an hour for it to take effect, and how quickly it finds everything depends on that search index, right? Or I can opt to just leave it off and turn it on later, and then review my settings and submit. But there's a quick look at DLP. Next up, we're going to talk through compliance solutions in Microsoft 365. So compliance features include insider risk management, communication compliance, information barrier, privileged access management, and customer lockbox. And we're really going to focus just on what these do. We're not going to look too much in the compliance center at how you configure these, because their purpose is, generally speaking, pretty obvious once you've heard it one time, and you'll just want to make sure that you remember this conceptually for the exam. So the insider risk management solution is all about helping our organization to detect, investigate, and act on risky or malicious activities. Now, this could help us to uncover a wide variety of inappropriate, unauthorized, unethical, or outright illegal behavior. Perhaps it's unintentional leaks of sensitive data or data spillage. Maybe it's intellectual property theft, fraud, insider trading, regulatory compliance violations. So it's less about whether or not it's intentional and more about whether or not it breaks an important policy. But it's all about managing internal risk within actions performed by our employees. But insider risk management allows us to set up a policy, define parameters. When the policy gets a hit, we get an alert, and the appropriate department and responsible parties can triage, investigate, and take action depending on what is found. Communication compliance. A communication compliance policy allows organizations to detect, capture, and take remediation actions for inappropriate messages. This really just ensures employees are treating one another properly. No bullying, no inappropriate language, no profanity, etc. Next up is information barriers. So information barriers, this feature in Microsoft 365 enables administrators to define policies to allow or prevent communications between groups of users within the organization. So Teams, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business support information barriers. This would be helpful in restricting communications that may result in a conflict of interest or a regulatory breach. So perhaps we have two lawyers within our firm that are working on cases where the data may overlap and where information sharing between the two results in a conflict of interest, for example. Or maybe the executives who receive executive bonuses are not allowed to see the voting around the awarding of these bonuses by the board, for example. So anytime we need to establish a barrier, information barriers is a feature we can use to establish that wall to prevent that communication if that's what we need. Privileged access management. So it's important you understand the basics of privileged access management and privileged identity management. So PAM and PIM. So let's start with privileged access management. This allows granular access control over privileged admin tasks in Microsoft 365. It prevents breaches that use existing privileged admin accounts with standing access to sensitive data and settings. So it's about granular access control over tasks. PAM focuses on tasks. Remember that for the exam. And making sure we don't have accounts out there with standing access to sensitive data and settings. It's implemented through a privileged access policy, and you'll do that in the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. So I just want to juxtapose or compare PIM versus PAM to make sure you have this locked and loaded for the exam. So privileged identity management, which is a feature in Azure and Azure AD. Well, it's really a feature in Azure AD, but we can leverage it across our roles in Azure and Azure AD. And PAM focuses on privileged admin tasks in Microsoft 365. So the key here, both provide time-limited elevation and access just in time, but PIM focuses on roles in Azure and Azure AD. PAM focuses on tasks in Microsoft 365. There we have it. All right, so let's talk about Office 365 Customer Lockbox. What is this exactly? Well, Customer Lockbox is all about managing Microsoft support access when you need support assistance. So with Customer Lockbox, here's the flow. So you create a support ticket with Microsoft. The Microsoft engineer who needs access to your environment creates a support ticket of their own. And in the Lockbox system within Microsoft, Microsoft receives the approval request. A manager at Microsoft approves the request. The customer then approves access, and the Microsoft engineer then gains access to the content they need to assist in the support case. So this access is granted for a limited duration. And everything that engineer does is going to be logged. All access and all activities are logged. And it's time-bound access. The support engineer has access for a limited period of time, but Customer Lockbox ensures we have control over who accesses that data from Microsoft support and for how long. And the purpose of e-discovery is called out in skills measured. So e-discovery is the process of identifying and delivering electronic information that can be used as evidence in legal cases. So we have a content search, which consists of searches and exports, but not holds. So the content search feature in Microsoft 365 in e-discovery doesn't allow us to create those holds. Now, core e-discovery, you can add sources and create holds and queries. You can export case results and manage the life cycle of the case. And then advanced e-discovery adds data custodians, allows us to automate notifications, view jobs, and additional settings. And I don't expect you're going to need to know the nitty-gritty details here. This is a fundamentals exam after all. But just to clarify a couple of terms here. So custodians, or sometimes called data custodians, are persons who have administrative control over a document or an electronic file. And jobs in e-discovery refers to any number of typically long-running actions like converting redacted documents to PDF or reconstructing conversations or estimating search results. So the content search tool allows us to search for in-place content like email, documents, instant messaging conversations within the org. We can use it to search content in Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive, Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, and Yammer groups. So it's about searching for in-place content, and really across the lot of Microsoft 365 services, as you see. And you'll also see mentions of Content Search e-discovery tool. So just to be safe and ensure you're prepared, I want to step through core e-discovery workflow and advanced e-discovery workflow with you quickly. So remember, e-discovery is related to legal cases, right? So after we create an e-discovery case, we perform a search for content. This content is typically going to have been what you need to search for has been provided to you through legal channels. And when you've made that search, you can export those results and download those results and share them with the appropriate parties. Typically, you're sharing that with your team of lawyers within the organization to deal with delivering that to the right parties. Now, advanced e-discovery workflow adds some additional capabilities. So with advanced e-discovery workflows, after we create an e-discovery case, we can add custodians to a case. Remember, custodians or data custodians are the folks who have ownership or control of documents, or maybe documents in a SharePoint site in a specific location. And we can search custodial data sources, and incidentally we can also search what you'd call non-custodial data sources, which are data sources that do not have a clear owner. You'll add that data to a review set. So we take those search results and we add those to a review set so they can go through a human review process to ensure they review and analyze the data in the set, that we have the appropriate data, that we're not delivering too much data, we're delivering only what's asked for. Minimizing the risk of oversharing, which would potentially have significant consequences in legal scenarios. And then we export and download the case data and deliver it to the appropriate parties. Now, this next data governance feature is not mentioned in the skills measured, but we know Microsoft exams tend to touch on the shiny new modern capabilities, and Azure Purview, which as of June 2021, the time we're recording here, is in preview. But Purview is a unified data governance service that helps you manage and govern on-premises, multi-cloud, and SaaS data. And moreover, it allows you to create an up-to-date map of your data landscape, to automate data discovery, classification, and to establish an end-to-end data lineage. So if I were memorizing this for the exam, knowing that it may not come up, but at some point in the future, depending on when you take the exam, it well might, the key phrase here is unified data governance, multi-cloud, automated, and data lineage. And you might ask, what the heck is data lineage? Well, that really speaks to establishing the origin of the data, what happens to it, and where it moves over time. So think of it as the timeline of the data. But Azure Purview is a new feature. I just wanted to make sure you're familiar. So in case it comes up on the exam, remembering that the skills measured is not definitive, nor is it exhaustive by Microsoft's own words. All right. So let's talk about core audit capabilities in Microsoft 365. So core audit allows organizations to view user and admin activity through a unified audit log, which is enabled by default. It allows search of many user and admin activities across a wide variety of Microsoft 365 searches. There are some aids in there that make searching through that audit log easier. But that unified audit log feature is enabled by default. However, not all services are configured to send all of their data there automatically. It supports Dynamics 365, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, Azure AD, a wide variety of sources. I found the other day Dynamics 365 doesn't send everything over to the unified audit log out of the box, so I had to go check some additional boxes. Now there's core audit, which we're talking about here, that unified log, and then there's advanced auditing. So the difference here is advanced auditing is used to conduct forensic and compliance investigations by increasing audit log retention. So we increase that retention, which provides longer term access to crucial events that may help determine the scope of a compromise. And it also provides faster access to the Office 365 Management Activity API. So advanced auditing, forensic, and compliance investigation focused, and helps determine the scope of a compromise, and it's probably worth mentioning, the advanced audit capabilities require an E5 license. And that does it for Microsoft 365 compliance topics. We're going to get to that last subheading now in Domain 4, which is describe Azure resource governance capabilities. So resource governance provides mechanisms and processes to maintain control over our resources in Azure. So for the exam, you want to know the capabilities of Azure Resource Locks, Blueprints, and Azure Policy. Those are called out in the skills measured. I'm also going to talk to you, just to be safe, about initiatives, tags, and management groups. We're going to talk a bit about logical constructs in Azure and the scope of our policies and RBAC, etc. If you've already taken the AZ-900 exam and seen my course over there, you're going to have seen some of this already, but if not, just to be safe, I want to make sure you have the full picture for exam day. So resource locks prevent other users in your organization from accidentally deleting or modifying critical resources. So the lock overrides any permissions the user might have. But it's all about preventing unwanted deletion and changes, and we're overriding permissions with resource locks. So the Cloud Adoption Framework. This is guidance from Microsoft designed to help you create and implement the business and technology strategies your organization needs to succeed in Azure. So the framework has basically 5 phases. So there's defining your strategy, plan, and readiness. And Microsoft provides resources and best practices to help you get there, essentially. So I kind of think of that as design and implementation. And then they also have resources around governance and management. And I think of that as kind of enforcing your standards and the ongoing admin. But as I mentioned, they have a great body of documentation, implementation guidance, best practices, and tools to help you to implement their framework. So let's talk about the other important aspects of cloud governance. I want to touch on policies, initiatives, and blueprint. So a policy is a definition of the conditions you want to control or govern. So for example, you could establish a policy that only allows your admins to deploy resources to certain Azure regions, or to only deploy specific Azure VM SKUs, or to establish certain settings that you require. An initiative is a collection of Azure policy definitions that are grouped together towards a specific goal. And when you're creating an initiative, Microsoft provides you a pretty good set of policy templates you can pick from. You don't have to build all of your policies from scratch. There's some foundational material there that's quite helpful. And then a blueprint is a container for composing sets of standards, patterns, and requirements for implementation of Azure Cloud Services, security, and design. You'll often see blueprint used in the same sentence as new environments. Tags. So a tag is a name and value pair used to logically organize Azure resources, resource groups, and subscriptions into a logical taxonomy. Tags can be the basis for applying business policies or tracking costs. Not explicitly called out in the skills measured, but I wanted to just get the concept in your head because it is used in the governance construct. You can also enforce tagging rules with Azure policies. So now let's talk about management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. So management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups can help us establish the scope when we're assigning policy. Subscriptions and resource groups are very common security boundaries. These are fairly important, so we're just going to cover them in case you are not familiar. But the scope of governance and RBAC configuration can leverage some of these logical elements. But it's all about scope. So a management group can contain one or more subscriptions. Your subscriptions will contain one or more resource groups. The resource group is the container that hosts your resources. You'll put your resources that have a common life cycle into a single resource group, generally speaking. So let's just break these down a bit further. So a management group provides a level of scope above subscriptions. So each directory is given a single top-level management group that's called root. And you can create management groups that contain subsets of your subscriptions. So just to be clear, you've got a management group. Let's just go back here. You've got a management group called root that contains all the subscriptions that are associated to your tenant. But you can create a custom management group that contains a subset of subscriptions. The subscription is that logical container used for provisioning resources in Azure. So why would I create multiple subscriptions? Well, when subscription limits are reached, we can only create so many of certain types of objects in subscription. So I might hit a limit. I might want to use different payment methods, so that's going to be a reason to use different subscriptions. I might want to isolate resources between departments, projects, etc. That's a clear security boundary. It could be a billing concern I have, but it could be isolating resources for the sake of security as well. So think of it as a boundary in that respect. Resource groups are containers that hold related resources for an Azure solution. You'll use a resource group to group resources that share a common resource lifecycle. Like when you deploy an Azure virtual machine, there are several logical components like a disk and a network adapter, maybe a public IP address. All of those resources will go into that same resource group because they share a common lifecycle. And the resource group is the boundary for deployment. That's the target, so it would naturally go there anyway. And then resources are entities managed by Azure, like a virtual machine, a virtual network, or a storage account, which go into that resource group. All right, so a management group can be used to aggregate policy and initiative assignments via Azure Policy. It can contain multiple subscriptions, and all new subscriptions are going to be placed under that root management group I mentioned is there by default, but you can create your own custom management groups to create subsets of subscriptions so you can then target policy, right? I can target policy and initiatives to multiple subscriptions that way. So subscriptions are a unit of management, billing, and scale within Azure. They can serve as a management boundary for assigning policy, governance, and isolation, which means they have a place in a security context, and that is one of isolation, establishing a management boundary where we can assign permissions separate from other subscriptions. And then resource groups are containers that hold resources with a common lifecycle. Common lifecycle is the key there. And then, of course, your resources are contained within the resource group. The resource group lives within exactly one subscription. So multiple resources in a resource group, that resource group resides within exactly one subscription. So when it comes to policy, and or role-based access control, these can all serve their purpose in terms of allowing us to scope policy or permissions to the appropriate level. So whether we're establishing policy that give us secure settings across our resources, or we're assigning role-based access control at the right level to ensure we have established least privilege, these entities, these constructs are going to be very useful. So if you weren't familiar with these, now you are. They factor in that security discussion, and therefore they are important. Congratulations, you've reached the end of the SC-900 exam cram. I hope you got value out of this content. Best of luck on the exam. If you have questions as you prepare, drop those questions here in the comments. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions on your preparation journey. If you have suggestions for future sessions, by all means, reach out and let me know. I will help where I can. And until next time, be well and stay safe.